Give a few more minutes for folks to join. Yes, Oh, can we mute? I'm going to mute everyone, and then, Bahman and Stephan, Barry, Natty, you guys can mute yourselves. Let's see if I can maybe. So did I get everyone?
Okay. So thank you, everyone. I think we will start. It's almost 1 p.m. So let me share my screen. So hello everyone. So welcome for this webinars about common forecasting methods and the mindset behind forecasting. So as you have noticed from the communication, these webinars will be focusing on forecasting demand for product and service and aims to bring up to speed with minimal pain. So we have today the book authors and the community expert that will be leading these webinars. I will give a quick introduction about IAPHL, and then I will introduce the book authors and then the community experts. Feel free to put your information in the discussion box so that we can have your contacts as well and know who are in the room. I don't know if it's clear enough for the diaporama. Okay. But basically, IAPHL is a professional association of public health logisticians. So being part of IAPHL has many benefits. One of it is the networking and being part of that community that is working in your field, which is the public health, logistic and supply chain. We have an internal platform that is called the listserv that we use for our interaction, but also sharing professional experience, policies or best practices of the industry. We also have libraries and tools that we share. So feel free to share any documents that you think that we can add to our library and that can really benefit our members. Apart from that, we have regular events and webinars like this one. We will keep you posted by our social media, and you can also follow us. We have a page on LinkedIn, Facebook, and we are active also on our emails. So I will maybe go ahead and present each person that will lead the meeting. Laila, if you're okay with that. Okay. Okay.
Am I presenting or you're presenting?
Normally I'm presenting. I don't know if you can see my screen.
Go ahead. Yes, we can see it.
Oh, you, okay. Okay. So we have in the room the Dr. Baham. So Dr. Baham is a reader Associate Professor in Data-Driven Decision Science at Cardiff Business School at Cardiff University in UK. So he served as the Director of Data Lab for Social Good Research Group at Cardiff University. And he's also the inaugural chair of the Forecasting for Social Good Committee within the International Institute of Forecaster. So Bahman specializes in development and application for forecasting and management science tools and techniques. He focuses lies in leveraging these methodologies to provide informed insights for planning and decision making in sector contributing to social good, including healthcare operation, global health, and humanitarian supply chains, social sustainability, and governmental policy. His collaborative effort has spanned a multitude of organizations in the UK and international level. A remarkable highlight of his contribution is his pivotal role in disseminating forecasting knowledge. Through his pioneering democratic forecasting initiative, sponsored by International Institute of Forecaster, Bahman has conducted impactful training sessions that have benefited over 1,000 learners in low and low middle income countries and in UK. So we would like to welcome Dr. Bahman, if he's in the room.
Thank you very much. I'm very delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very much. And then the second book author is Dr. Stephan Kolassa. So Dr. Stephan Kolassa is a data science expert at SAP Switzerland and an honorary researcher at the Center of Marketing Analytics and Forecasting at Lancaster University, Management of School. So his main interests are forecasting in the retail sector for replenishment and other processes, as well as more general supply chain forecasting and quality measurement for forecasting in general. So in 2023, Stephan was selected as a fellow of the International Institute of Forecasting. So we would like to welcome Dr. Stephan as well. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And then we have the third book author, which is Professor Enno. Professor Enno joined Wisconsin School of Business in 2015 after spending 8 years on the faculty at Carlson School of Management, University of Minnesota, and 3 years on the faculty at College of Business, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He received a PhD in operations management at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His expertise is in the field of predictive analytics, demand forecasting, pharmaceutical supply chain, augmented reality, and project management. His research currently focuses on augmented reality in manufacturing, as well as AI-human interaction. He was the principal investigator on a grant for the Food and Drug Administration. Professor Enno has published in leading outlets such as Management Science, Organization Science, Journal of Operation Management, Product and Operation Management, Strategic Management Journal, and Manufacturing and Services Operation Management. His work has also been featured in the Harvard Business Review and the California Management Review. He is the author of Demand Forecasting for Executive and Professionals, a recent book on forecasting that we'll be discussing also today, and organizational decision making. He has won numerous prizes for his research, such as the M&OMS Young Scholar Award and the Godmeets Distinguished Research Award. So we would like to welcome Professor Enno. Thank you to be there.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So we also have in a room our community experts that will be leading the discussion. So we have Dr. Laila that intervened at the beginning of it. So Dr. Laila, I will present you as well, or you want to present yourself? Your mic is muted. Your microphone is muted, sorry.
Thank you, Nadine. Yeah, Laila Akhlaghi, been with JSI for 13 years, over 20 years of experience in pharmaceutical supply chain management, mostly forecasting in lower middle income countries for pharmaceuticals. I'm happy to be here with my colleague, Barry. You can go to him.
Good morning. Thanks. Yes, I'm Barry Chovitz, and I'm with the Global Health Supply Chain Procurement and Supply Management Project at Chemonics, and I've been doing this since the early 90s.
Yeah, great. So I think we can start. I will give the lead to Laila for the rest of the discussion for now.
Sure, no problem. And I'm just gonna ask Bahman to share his screen. I think as soon as I heard about this book and started reading it, I attended one of their earlier presentations. I thought it was really valuable discussion for all of us to have at IAPHL, and is the reason why I requested this session to be held. So I hope you find it as useful, and I'm glad to have 3 experts who hopefully will stay on to the IAPHL listserv and can assist as needed. Bahman, we see your note screen. We just saw your presentation screen, so you clicked away from it. But if you could change the view to the slides, it might be better.
So I will
Thank
share
you.
in the chat box the link to the book, just in case some people hasn't have access to it yet.
Right. And just to say that the PDF, there's a link to it for the free version, but there's also a paper copy that can be bought, I believe, from the CRC Press publications. Thank you, guys. We'll let you take over. We're going to do a presentation for about 45 minutes. You can post your questions into the chat box, and we'll reserve them. This is going to be about another hour and 15 minutes, 45 minutes of which will be the presentation, and we'll have half an hour left over for conversation and discussion as needed. Thank you. Go ahead.
All right. Bahman, maybe go to the next slide. Do you want to give a brief overview of the agenda, Bahman?
Absolutely, yeah. So, hi everyone. Basically, this is the outline of what we're going to cover today. We start with the importance of forecasting in planning and decision making, and why we do forecasting in the first place. Following that, we go through a forecasting workflow which is required to follow to produce a forecast that we need to inform the decision. And then we will show you a simple example of a forecasting and how we should, or we can produce forecasting in different way, and how we can visualize it as well. After that, we go and look at the importance of knowing the data that you're using to produce the forecast, and also discuss different components that we can find in a time series that are used in classical time series forecasting methods. Following that, we dig into the details of data quality and how important it is when it comes to forecasting processes and producing a forecast. Next, we look at the range of forecasting methods, from very simple to complicated or complex, and we discuss the advantages of them. And then we discuss how to build a forecasting model. We provide a sort of steps to go through to do that. Following that, if you manage a forecasting team, or you have forecasters in your team, we discussed also what attributes you may need to have a perfect forecaster in your team. And finally, we discussed some organizational side of forecasting beyond like technical aspect of it.
All right. So the introduction, starting with a little bit of the background of how this book came about. I have been research in the area of forecasting for a long time, and I do a lot of executive education in the area. And sometime back in, I don't know, 2014 or so, I was a little bit frustrated because there were a lot of books out there that really talk about forecasting from a technical perspective, and they're excellent. They're really, really good. The book by Hindman and others, for example. But I felt like there's so many people in organizations who basically have to deal with forecasts without being forecasters, without necessarily, being as technical. And so, forecasting is sort of, and many of these people don't really have a formal training in forecasting, but they still need to use forecasts for decision making. So I thought this would be an excellent topic for a book. Let's write a book which is targeted at, the executives and the professionals who really have to deal with forecasts in their daily lives without actually being responsible for creating the forecasts. And I approached Stephan about the idea behind this book, and we wrote a book together called Demand Forecasting for Managers, and that has been out for quite a while. And sometime in 2020, Bahman approached us and basically said, "Hey, I really like your book." And as an author, that's always great to hear. But Bahman also said, "Look, it's been 5 or 6 years since you published it. We have to update it, and more importantly, we have to make it available for free so that people can use it more easily." And so Stephan and I looked at that and said, that makes perfect sense. Let's update the book, and let's create an online version of the book that is available for free. And we worked on this for the past 2 years, and the online book has been out now for a couple of months or so. So in general, I think what we're trying to emphasize is, oftentimes people get frustrated about forecasting, but forecasting is incredibly necessary, right? Forecasts are always wrong. That's why people are frustrated about forecasting. Firms never seem to be able to get their forecast right, but that's just in the nature of forecasting, right? Forecasting is ultimately about predicting the future. It's about estimating the parameters of probability distributions, and outcomes are simply, somewhat random. So the question is not, can you predict the future perfectly? The question is, how good is your process that helps you to enable to characterize that distribution? And so forecasting is fundamental, it's necessary, and even if people don't forecast explicitly or have a forecasting function, they will still forecast implicitly in their head, right? So even sort of a prediction of like, okay, we're not going to forecast, we're going to move to a pull system in our supply chain. There often is a prediction there that demand is overall fairly stable, right? So that is still a forecast. So whether you explicitly or implicitly forecast, forecasting is vital to all organizations. It is the essence of planning. And without good forecasts, really a lot of planning steps that depend on forecasting are at risk of being, ultimately useless, right? So good forecasting is the input to planning decisions, right? And this is, I think, one of the very first lessons is also every forecast needs to have a purpose. We don't forecast for the sake of forecasting, right? We forecast because forecasting is an input into decision making and planning. And forecasting doesn't have to be complex. In some sense, there's a value to forecasts that are easy to understand, simple, interpretable. There are some certainly complex forecasting methods out there. But one theme that we emphasize throughout the book is relatively simple forecasting methods that are very easy to understand can sometimes lead to very good forecasts already. So a lot of times the first step for an organization shouldn't be to find the best, the most sophisticated and complex forecasting method out there. It's just to find a simple and robust method that delivers good results and everybody can understand, right? So, but on the plus side, if you get this right, if you really take forecasting seriously and you implement it well in an organization, you usually see very good outcomes, right? So planning becomes more accurate. You can move the organization away from firefighting. Usually then you get higher service levels, lower safety stock requirements, overall less friction in your operations, right? So forecasting is a huge coordinating mechanism within an organization. If forecasting works well, your organization can work a whole lot better. And the benefits of having a good forecasting process that everybody understands and forecasts that are useful for decision making and that everybody uses for their planning are usually tremendous. Bahman, maybe you can go to the next slide and talk about the workflow of how to set up a good forecasting process.
So producing a forecast to inform decisions and planning processes is generally an iterative process and involves different steps that are illustrated in this flowchart from step 1 to step 10. So as Enno highlighted, we typically use forecasting to inform decisions, but surprisingly, sometimes we actually forget about that fundamental first step and we are too enthusiastic to go to data analysis or build a model without knowing exactly why we need actually to produce the forecast in the first place and how that forecast is going to be used. So we shouldn't really rush to model building. We have to invest some time to first understand the decision or multiple decision possibly requires forecasting at the first place and identify them correctly. And then this typically dictate also what we need in terms of forecasting requirements. So first identify the decision, then each decision should dictate what you need to forecast. And in terms of the forecasting requirements, there are some important aspects that we need to consider. First of all, we need to know what is the variable or the thing that you want to forecast. Is it, for instance, the quantity issued for a particular pharmaceutical product? Is it the number of admission in the hospital? Is it the demand for or sales for a particular item in a store? So what is that thing that we need to forecast? Another important aspect is the horizon and time granularity. So how many periods into the future you want to forecast, and is it the daily, monthly, weekly, or maybe a quarterly granularity that you are interested in there? So you need also to be specific about that. You also need to determine how often you want to produce a forecast. Do you produce the forecast every week or every month or every 6 months or so? Another important dimension to consider here is in terms of cross-sectional granularity. So by cross-sectional granularity, I mean, do you need to produce a forecast for just one product or for multiple products that are grouped into a family of products together, or maybe distributed in warehouses in different geographical location, and maybe aggregated into a national level or disaggregated into regions or point of sales or healthcare centers, for instance. So this is another sort of dimension that you need to think. And there are some other aspects that you can think about them, and we are discussing them in the book as well. So once we know that what are the forecasting requirements, we can go and collect relevant data information to start analyzing the data and also build a model. So here there are generally 4 types of data that you need to look for. The first one is the past historical data, or what we call the time series data of the variable that you want to forecast. So if you want to forecast the consumption of a product, you have to go and look at the past consumption of that product over years that you have recorded. That's the first and probably the most important source of information. The second source of information is what we call a deterministic predictor. So sometimes the consumption or the variable that you want to forecast is affected by different events. For instance, the consumption of a product might be affected by fiscal year, might be affected by different events like maybe flooding events, but also like public holidays and things like that. So some of these events, they are known in advance. For instance, if you think public holidays affect the consumption of product, well, we know when we have public holidays for the next year or so. So the value are known in advance. So we could use them as a source of information to build a model. So we call them deterministic predictors. So they can help as a driving factors of variation in the forecast variable, so they could be useful in building models. The second source of data that you can collect, we call them stochastic predictors. So again, these are predictors or driving factors of the forecast variable, but their future values are not known. So if you want to use this variable to build a model, you may need to estimate their values as well. And sometimes you need to be careful, because that brings an extra layer of uncertainty to the modeling. But again, we can build the model in a way that, use these predictors in a way that avoid that sort of thing as well. And we have discussed again in the book, and this is where we can use lead or lag predictors sometimes. And then finally, we can also use the expertise of personnel or people working in the organization as an important source of information that is required to build a model. So once we collected the information, well, we may have them in a different formats or from different sources as well. So typically the data that we have, they're not ready to be used for data analysis or time series analysis and forecasting immediately. So we need to prepare them for that. And the preparation sometimes requires actually putting them in the right format for the analysis. But most importantly, here we have to check the quality of the data that actually we use. And later we will discuss about the quality of data a bit more detail. But unfortunately, there is no shortcut to data quality checking. If you have a data set with 10 columns, you have to really go and look at this 10 columns one by one and look at and evaluate and examine the data quality issues for each of them, and to make sure they are actually right. And if there are issues, you have to fix them before going for model building. Following that, we use data visualization. Well, we can actually use data visualization with the step 4. Sometimes this step helps also with the data quality check, but one of the main purposes of data visualization is to also understand whether we have systematic information in the data, and that helps also to identify the right forecasting method later. Following that, we have to choose and train models, and here we can have a list of different forecasting methods in our toolbox. And again, later on we can elaborate a little bit more on this. What are the different type of methods that we can use? So we have a list of models typically. And again, the reason why we have a list of models is because there is no single forecasting method that can work for every single time series data. So we need to always have a handful number of methods in our toolbox. And then we use these models to train on the data, like estimating their parameters, and that help us also to produce a forecast. And this forecast could be represented in different ways, as a point, as a range or interval, or as an entire distribution. And then in step 8, we have to evaluate the quality of the forecast. And then there are different dimensions to quality. One of them is accuracy, but we might be also interested in other things like running time or interpretability, or even the implications of the forecast on the decision that we are going to inform. So as you can see, this is actually quite, as you know, the flowchart shows, is an iterative process, and you may need to go through this multiple times. And once we are happy with the forecast we generated, we can communicate it to the different audience or those who are using it. And here there are two important things to consider as well. first, what we have to communicate. And then the second important thing is how to communicate it. And here visualization, of course, is an important tool. And then as a final step, sometimes you may need to adjust the forecasts that are produced by statistical or machine learning methods, because, and of course, you need to be careful with this, not adjusting the forecast for any reason. There are two main reasons that you can think of this as a good reason to adjust. Maybe one is if you have new information that just came out, and this information, they are not actually in the historical data, so there might be a legitimate reason to adjust the forecast. The second reason is if you believe that there are some important information that are not built into the model, and then you have that information, that could be also a reason to adjust the forecast. But again, the question is, if you have that information, why not to build it right from the beginning into model and avoid adjusting it using your own expertise? So the last thing I want to emphasize is in all these forecasting steps illustrated in this workflow, the business context or the domain knowledge is fundamental, without which it is very unlikely to produce actually a forecast that can be really helpful to inform a decision in practice.
Throughout the book, we really try to emphasize relatively simple examples. And again, we also have an emphasis, I think, on relatively simple methods. And so here's sort of an example that we start out with in the book, and it's a very simple time series of, essentially just a level and noise around that. Bahman, can you just give me the rest of the slide? Yeah, thank you so much. And a couple of things to sort of, I think, realize from that up front, even if you don't know anything about forecasting, right? If you look at the time series in the upper right-hand side of the slide, you already know quite a bit about the demand. You know it's going to be somewhere between maybe 1,500 and 3,500. Those are sort of the valid points. So you kind of already know the range, right? And then you can estimate where's sort of the center of that distribution, somewhere maybe at around 2,000 something, right? So I think intuitively that's what we would do if we look at data like this, right? And what I just did is sort of an important part about forecasting, right? It's about understanding a probability distribution. We're not actually predicting exactly what the next observation is going to be. We're basically estimating how is the distribution going to look like and what we think is most likely going to happen, right? And this is a huge discrepancy in many organizations where I think a lot of people think about a point forecast, which is sort of the one prediction of like, okay, demand is going to be 2,000 exactly, right? But it's very unlikely that it's going to be exactly that. It's going to be something around that, right? So you have to really step away from thinking about forecasting as being something that produces a single number that is going to happen, but more about something that estimates a probability distribution, which communicates an inherent sense of uncertainty and unpredictability as well. A very simple method to use for forecasting over here is what would be called exponential smoothing. It's a classic time series forecasting method. In this case, it would be single exponential smoothing. And you can see sort of in the second graph in the middle over there, the forecasts from that, for a couple of weeks out would essentially be a straight line with a sort of, increasing funnel in terms of the sort of a prediction interval around that. And the two things I want to highlight over here. The first thing is, it's very counterintuitive that the point forecasts that come out of a method like this could be essentially a straight line where there's so much variation in the time series, right? And a lot of people look at this set of forecasts of like you're predicting the same number over and over again. That's really weird given how much variation there's in the data. But that's exactly what a forecasting method should do, right? A forecasting method filters out noise. And if a forecasting method decides that variation just represents noise, it is actually not used for estimation and prediction. So forecasts, a series of forecasts into the future should look a lot more stable, if you will, than the series of data that leads up to it. And the more you predict into the future, the less certain you become about the forecast. So prediction intervals, which we symbolize here by the gray shaded area, tend to increase over time, because the more you predict into the future, the more uncertain your forecasts really are, right? And that's usually reflected in increasing prediction intervals. You can, of course, also, instead of using these prediction intervals, which are, you know, it's not exactly right, but they're more or less best case, worst case scenarios that are captured by the bounds of the interval. They're not exactly best case and worst case, because they usually represent sort of a 90th percentile, or 90% of the distribution, but still that's maybe a good way of thinking about it. But you can also just, you know, use an actual probability distribution or a density function to represent the uncertainty in a forecast. And we've done that in the last graph, right? So these are ways of how you create a forecast, in this case with a simple method, and also how you communicate it in terms of either prediction intervals or a predictive density. I think a common mistake so many organizations make is that they only provide a point forecast without any sense of uncertainty around that. And you run into a huge problem, because then, first of all, nobody knows how much uncertainty there really is. And some people even might think that the forecast is more certain than it really is, right? So one key point I emphasize in training for forecasting is always think about forecasts as being inherently uncertain, and make sure that the way you communicate that within the organization is clear, right? Everybody should know how much uncertainty there is in a forecast, because otherwise it's entirely useless for decision making. Right? If you want to figure out, for example, how much to order based on a forecast, you need to understand how much uncertainty there is. Otherwise, you have no idea how big the safety stock should be. So, all right. Laila asks over here, how can certainty in a point forecast be a bad thing? Well, the more, let's put it this way, accuracy is not a bad thing, right? If your forecasts become more accurate, that's entirely great. But your own certainty about the forecast, you should be as certain about the forecast as you can be, right? Forecasts are inherently uncertain, and your own opinion about that should reflect that, and everybody in the organization should have the same opinion. Next slide, over back to Bahman.
Yeah, wonderful. So when it comes to like data analysis, it is fundamental to know to make sure you know your data well. And again, there are two main purposes. First of all, we have to know our data and make sure that these are the right quality that we build the model based on. And Stephan will talk about the data quality in more detail later. But again, in practice, in general, you know, we don't really face the time series data that are well behaved in terms of having a strong trend and seasonality. Often the time series are affected by many events, so it is important to capture those sort of information. I think many organizations, they are very good in capturing sales, maybe consumption, and this sort of thing, but they don't really collect much information about the different sort of events that may affected over time in the past that could be used in building models. So I think that's one thing that we have to emphasize on. So the data quality aspect is one important issue, and as I highlighted before, the domain knowledge is fundamental here, and I don't think without having the business context or domain knowledge in that specific area, we could build a forecasting model that produce forecasts that are reliable to inform decisions in practice. So another important aspect when it comes to knowing your data is visualizing it. So often we start by plotting the time series data. And actually we do this using different sort of data visualization, because each type of, or each kind of data visualization that we use, it may reveal a different aspect of the time series or data that has not been revealed by the one we have used before. And this is also important. It's important to understand the sort of systematic information or patterns we have in our data, because we know that if there is no signal or systematic information in a time series that we evaluate, it is unlikely that the time series can be forecasted accurately. So you may have a time series like this example that is quite easy to forecast, but if the time series lacks signal or systematic information and full of randomness or noise, it is unlikely that we can actually do much here in terms of forecasting, because forecasting is about capturing systematic information in the time series and use it to build the models. So when it comes to knowing the data, we should look at, if there is a trend, there is a seasonality, if there is autocorrelation in the data, for instance, the consumption of today, how it is related to the previous days or previous months. This is what autocorrelation actually means there. If there are peaks, like extremely high or low numbers, for instance, in the time series data, we should go and investigate them and understand why that happened, which driving factor that might be useful there. For instance, these are two examples from ambulance demand data. And actually, if you look at the extreme, like low numbers here, most of them somehow are related to different public holidays. So we need maybe to include them into building models. So this is like a time series of hourly data. But there are some important information that we cannot really see just by plotting that hourly data set. But if you look at it from another perspective, which is what we depicted here in this figure below. So we put, for instance, the hours of the day in x-axis and then separating the demand by day of the week. We clearly see some interesting information that interacts between the day of week and also hour of the day. So here we see from midnight to like early morning, the ambulance demand for Sunday and Saturday are higher than the rest of the week. But if we go and look at, let's say from 8 p.m. to midnight, we see another interesting pattern there, where actually Saturday evening and Friday evening, they have more demand. And during the day, we see the Monday and Friday, they have the highest demand. And actually, this cannot be seen by looking at the time plot. It requires to looking at data from another perspective. So it is important to understand the sort of pattern we have in the time series, but it is also fundamental to go and use the domain knowledge to understand the different driving factors that might affect the consumption. For instance, if you look at this time series here, just applying a time series method and this time series might not result in a good forecast, because this time series is affected by different sort of events. We need to understand what happened and then collect information about them and then build them into the model to be able to produce a forecast that is reliable. So when it comes to the time series components that we may see in classical time series forecasting models, we have a trend, seasonality, autocorrelation, moving average, and a component that we call it reminder. Basically, the time series that we have could be decomposed into some of these components like trend and seasonality. Some of these components could be seen clearly, with eyes. Sometimes it's easy to pick a trend that is increasing or decreasing. Seasonality is a consistent pattern that happens within a fixed period of time. And when it comes to seasonality, this fixed period of time is important. For instance, if you deal with monthly data, this fixed period of time is 12 months from January to December. And
Leave from there and go eat.
And if there is a seasonality, so we should see that systematic or consistent pattern within that 12 months. If you deal with daily time series data, then this fixed period of time is 7 days, and then we should see this consistent pattern within this fixed period of time. Autoregression is another component that you may observe, and this is about how observations are associated with the previous observation. So how the demand, for instance, for next month might be associated with demand that has been observed in the months before, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, and so on. We may also have another component like moving average, and this shouldn't be confused with a method called moving average, which is used for smoothing. This is a component related to the sort of errors or residuals we have in the models. And again, this could be used as a component to build the models. This is where we have sort of ARIMA models. And reminders could be actually a component. Like if you look at this plot, we have a time series, we decompose it into seasonal, trend, and reminder. And in this example, reminder basically is whatever is remained after removing trend and seasonality. So reminders sometimes could be just noise or random variations, but a reminder sometimes may also contain some useful information, in particular when it comes to identifying driving factors that are not, of course, the trend or seasonality components. Stephan?
All right, thank you, Bahman. One key aspect of forecasting, or essentially any data science task, is the quality and availability of data. So, and that in forecasting relates mainly to two different sources of data. So one is the focal time series, or the time series that we want to forecast, if there is a time series, if we have a new product that we need to forecast that we don't have any historical data, but then we'll at least have some data from related or similar products in the past. So then that's the time series that we have to worry about. And the other thing is any causal drivers. So if we think that consumption of a particular product is driven by temperature, then we're interested in historical temperatures and forecasts of temperatures. And if there is a period when we don't have the temperature, then we have a problem that we want to address. And in my personal impression, other people may see that differently, getting better data and understanding data better is usually more important than coming up with new models. So there's, especially in data science, there are people that build new and nicer and more complicated models every single day, and there's more and more papers about more and more complex deep learning architectures and boosting methods and so on and so forth. It always, these always are compared on one data basis, essentially on one amount of data. And what I usually suspect very much is that investing the time in understanding the data that we have, in cleansing the data, in finding new data, is probably much better spent than in coming up with a new and more complex method and model. All right, so how do we deal with data? We can't tell you how you need to deal with your data, because we are not the domain experts in what you are, in the challenges you are facing. You're the domain experts. I'm very much into retail forecasting in Europe, so I would be able to tell you what data is important for a retailer, for a supermarket. I wouldn't be able to say much about forecasting in the pharma or in the life sciences sector, but you need to understand, based on your domain knowledge, what kind of data is important, typically the time series you want to forecast, and any other data sets, any other drivers. Your domain knowledge will also inform you how to look for data issues. So what kind of problem do you anticipate in your data, and how would you detect that problem, whether that problem exists. For instance, we discussed some of the data issues beforehand. Things like perhaps the people that collect the data are not data scientists, but are just doctors and pharmacists. And doctors and pharmacists are not doctors and pharmacists because they like to collect data, and then they be something different. They're doctors and pharmacists because they want to help people. They don't want to fill in lots of paper forms and put in numbers. So there might be problems with the data that they return, that they report. So perhaps you don't have data for some time period. So you know what to look for. You need to look for time periods when you don't have data on a particular product. Now you know how to search for that. And domain knowledge will also guide you in how to get better data or how to address that. In this case, it would probably be a case of talking to the doctors and pharmacists and discussing with them how important the data is for ways to help them do their jobs better. Perhaps the added expense, the added hassle of collecting data is simply not worth it. Perhaps the data science aspect, the forecasting aspect, is not that high a priority, and people are better served by not spending too much time on the data collection, just doing their job, helping people, and the forecaster needs to do their own job and find some way of getting into possibility of addressing data problems. How do we deal with data problems? So if there's data missing, for instance, if people simply don't collect data, or the data was collected but destroyed or lost somewhere in between, there are ways of imputing missing data. So simplest way would be take the last data point before the hole in the data and the first data point after the hole in the data, and just put in a linear line between these data points, so simple interpolation. You can also correct problematic data. So if there is an outlier in your data and you suspect that somebody just put the decimal point at the wrong place, then you can just divide it by 10 or multiply it by 10, however the case may be. So again, it's a case of design of domain knowledge, of understanding where the data comes from and what is a reasonable range for the data. Or finally, an alternative would be that you can also, if you run causal models like regression, neural networks, and so on, there's a possibility of just marking incorrect data. You don't try to correct the incorrect data. You can simply mark the data as this is suspect, this probably does not make sense, mark it as a predictor. Then in modeling, the predictor will capture the effect of the incorrect data. So I personally prefer the last point the most. And what you can also do, especially in causal models, is just to remove the incorrect data if you're not running time series models. We'll come to that in a second. I personally am not a big fan of interpolation because it always simulates knowledge that you don't have, and kind of discards all the uncertainty in the data that you should actually be considering. Yeah. All right, Bahman, thank you very much. All right, a single slide on different forecasting methods, and we're not going to go into these, and there is not a single formula in this entire presentation. If you want the formulas, they're in the book, and if you want even more formulas, then we have further resources where you can go into all the technical details. Just a single slide. So there's essentially a trade-off between complexity, which is often related to accuracy, not always, often, and interpretability. So there's very simple methods like you take the time series, you take the historical mean and say, that's my point forecast. Take historical spreads and say, that's my interval forecast. So that's a very simple method. It's very simple to explain and to use, and you don't need a lot of software and you don't need to code a lot of stuff. You can just calculate means and standard deviations and quantiles using Excel or any free software like Python or R. So that is simple and straightforward and easily understood, and often actually surprisingly effective, often very better than more complex methods. The next step would be the classical time series methods like exponential smoothing and the Riemann Croston's method for intermittent demands. These are main workhorses for forecasting. The problem is they can't model causal effects, and causal effects are often important, not always, often. So if you have causal effects, drivers, predictors, whatever you want to call them, there's methods like linear regression. It's still pretty simple. It's still easily understood, and it can model causal effects. And if you want to get even more complex than that, you can look at tree-based methods like random forests, you can look at boosting, neural networks, deep learning, more and more different things. There's lots of materials online to learn these things, but those require a lot more investment in terms of data science understanding, in terms of programming skills. We'll come to skills later on, and they're much harder to explain. So if your job relies on people understanding and trusting your forecasts, then it's probably best to at least consider the more simple ones, because those are just so much easier to understand and to explain to people. And in the end, as we saw on the flow chart that Bahman presented at the very beginning, there is always human judgment, because humans will always take your forecasts and then improve, or perhaps not improve, but definitely change them. It's always good if you can establish a process where human adjustments can be judged after the fact. Did these add value or did they destroy value? Did these improvements or did these changes improve the forecasts or did they make the forecast worse? Because very often human judgment makes forecasts worse, and that is a difficult conversation to have. It's hard to convince people that they're chasing noise or something, but it's often a better way to improve forecasts if you can just make sure that the value destroying parts of the judgmental interventions do not happen. That's often better than trying to change the method to something more complicated. I'm just taking a look at the chat. In an organization with over 100 SKUs, which forecasting method is best and how frequent should the forecasting be, quarterly or annually? Oh, lots of questions here coming in. Perhaps we just take them at the very end. All right, so let's continue. Bahman, thank you very much. Can I click one more? All right, so how do we build forecasting models? So what do we start with? How do we continue? Our recommendation is always start simple. So this is actually pretty analogous to what we saw on the previous slide. Start with the simple methods. Start with a historical mean, the historical quantiles, or also the last observation. The last observation carried forward is often useful, sometimes a little too nervous because it depends on just one observation, but it's something you should consider. Often very effective, hard to beat, very simple to build such a forecast, and should always serve as a benchmark. So if you have a complicated ARIMA method that you just implemented and you find that your ARIMA method, a hugely complicated tool, forecasts worse than the historical mean, then that's an uncomfortable but important piece of information. Once you've built your benchmarks, these simple methods, that's when you can take a look at time series methods. So these are the non-causal methods like exponential smoothing and ARIMA. They're implemented in many different pieces of software. For instance, in R, there's the forecast and the fable packages. That's free. You can just use it. There's books online that explain how they're used. And these are, I would say, the gold standard in terms of automatic forecasting. I would very much recommend not to select or build models on your own. Just use the automatic ARIMA methods in the forecast package or ETS in the forecast package. There's a lot of disinformation on the internet about using autocorrelation function or partial autocorrelation functions to build your own forecasting model. I very much counsel not to use that because it's a waste of time, and those automatic methods work much better, and they've been validated by 20 years of usage. And the people who built them are probably the greatest living experts on forecasting. Once you've done that, especially if you have causal information, any drivers that you think will improve your forecast, then you can look at causal methods like, as I said, regression boosting, neural networks. And here the danger always is you need to be aware of overfitting. There is always a temptation to add more and more causal effects. And the more data we have, the more we have this temptation, oh, perhaps weather improves our forecast. Well, let's just add it. It's a causal effect, it's a predictor, add it in there. And then people are sometimes surprised to see that the weather did not improve the forecast. And that can be for a multitude of reasons. One reason is that if you just add more and more predictors, and at some point your model starts chasing the noise. And if it starts chasing the noise, that is overfitting, and then your forecast will be worse than if you hadn't changed the noise, point one. Point two, especially with weather, with some predictors, just like the weather, we don't know the future values. So if we think something is driven by the weather, then we need the future weather to forecast. But it's very hard to predict the weather of more than a week or 2 weeks out. So if you want to have a forecast for 4 weeks out, and we want to include the weather, then we have a problem because we don't have reliable weather forecasts 4 weeks out. So any weather forecast that we feed in as a predictor for the forecast will come with a huge error by itself. And that error will go straight through to the forecast of whatever we're actually forecasting, vaccines, pharmaceuticals, whatever. So the question is always one of the importance of predictors, the quality of predictors. Do you get good data? If you have good predictors, then better to use them than if you have bad data, and the forecastability of the predictors themselves. Because as per weather, even if weather is hugely important for your sales, if you can't forecast it out for the period where you need it, you have a problem. Can you click once more, Bahman, please? Because finally, there's one tool that you should always consider, and that is combination, forecast combination. As very often, combinations of forecasts are better than selecting single methods. So you may have in your toolbox, you may have a REMA, you may have exponential smoothing, you have the overall mean. Question always is, now I have 3 different methods, which one do I use? And the forecaster would often say, don't choose, just use all of them and take the average. So if one forecast is 10 and the next is 15 and the next is 17, just take the average of the 3, which something like, I can't get it together right now, it's something like 13 or something. And perhaps that's very often the best forecast, just take averages. You can always think about, and it's often the case that if your constituent methods are very different, if you have a neural network and an ARIMA and a judgmental forecast, those are very different things. And the more different they are, the better they work together very often. That's empirical, that's not a proven fact, that's just an empirical observation. And at some point you may wonder, well, I can take averages, that sounds good. Let's take weighted averages and weight them so that accurate methods get a higher weight and inaccurate methods get a lower weight. By all means, try that. Just don't be surprised if perhaps the unweighted averages work better than weighted averages. That's been known as the forecast combination puzzle, that unweighted averages outperform or often outperform weighted averages. And where does that come from? There's one possible explanation that trying to optimize the weights adds another source of uncertainty into your forecast, and uncertainty in forecasts can lead to more error. So that may be one point here. Bahman, can you click once more? Thank you. Let's go on to the human side of forecasting. So we've talked about methods and about data, and all that is very good. But as Enno was saying at the very beginning, forecasting is more than methods and data. Forecasting is a social exercise and something that involves lots of humans. And there's Venn diagrams of data scientists out there on the internet, and we took one of those and expanded it. And what most people have in mind in forecasters or data scientists is somebody who knows statistics, somebody who knows programming, somebody who has domain knowledge. We put business in here, but that is just shorthand for domain knowledge. And what we are added to that is the dimension of communication. Communication has many tie-ins with forecasting. Communication starts at the very beginning of a flow chart that Bahman presented at the very beginning. Communication helps you understand what you're forecasting for, because you, the forecaster, talk to the people that consume your forecasts, to the people that derive value from your forecasts, and you need to understand what they're doing, what their pain point is, what do they expect from your forecast, and that is all the entire question of what are we forecasting for. To understand that, you need to talk to people. And many forecasters are more technical people and more introverted and are more comfortable with data and computers and with humans, and that is often a source of misunderstanding. So you need to communicate at the very beginning of the forecasting exercise, and then throughout the entire forecasting exercise, it's always good to talk to the people and to bounce things off them. Here's what I'm thinking of, here's predictors that I'm considering, do these sound important to you? And at the very end, you have a forecast, and now you need to sell this forecast or communicate the forecast to people that take decisions based on the forecast. And if you can't communicate your forecast well, if you can't explain why your forecast looks like this and not like that, why your forecast has a bump here and no bump there, then people may not trust your forecast. And if you're forecasting and nobody trusts your forecast, then you just wasted your time and everybody's time, because then people will start using their own forecasts or gut feelings, which are always also forecasts. And then, yeah, the forecasting was kind of a waste. And so therefore, communication is quite as important as the other dimensions that are also important. I'm not disregarding here, absolutely not. I say statistics, programming, domain knowledge, these are hugely important. It's just that communication is at least as important as the other three. Bahman, one more click, please. I think this is Enno again.
Yeah, back to me. Thank you, Stephan. We always enjoy your presentation of the four-dimensional Venn diagram. So fantastic work. I just want to spend a few minutes talking about what we call the organizational barriers, and that's really to emphasize that forecasting doesn't exist in isolation. Sometimes we maybe wish that we have the lonely forecaster on the mountain who comes up with a prediction, and then everybody uses that prediction. But in practice, of course, because forecasting influences so many decisions in organizations, it can be a highly political process, right? Planning in general is a cross-functional process because you need to coordinate demand plans with supply chain plans, with hiring plans, with cash flow plans, etc. Right? So this planning is a cross-functional process. And there are, of course, sales and operations planning processes designed to specifically address that. But you have to be very careful that your forecast can remain as objective as possible in light of that. And I would say objectivity is threatened by two things. I mean, the first thing is clearly the individual biases that people can bring in just because of our limitations in processing data, right? So there's a lot of research, multiple decades of research now that go into documenting the sort of the fallacies of human judgment, if you will. Actually, I think I just reread a study from the 1950s by Meal, which is very famous, that has documented since the 50s that it's very hard for people to beat kind of statistical methods in judgment, right? So we know kind of about all the biases that people bring in when they look at data. So in forecasting, for example, they get anchored on recent data. So they tend to neglect the bigger picture and become very focused on recent data. That's really only a good strategy for forecasting if you have highly changing data, right? So if you have time series which are overall stable but noisy, then if you basically react mostly to recent data and ignore long-term averaging, you're mostly reacting to noise, and that can be very, very detrimental. Representativeness is another important bias where basically if you give people a time series of data and you ask them to predict the next point or points in the time series, they act like as if they simulate the time series. So they create forecasts that look like the data. But again, forecasts are noise reduction techniques. So the set of forecasts that a good method creates will contain a lot less variability than what is in the data. And that's usually something that is counter to our judgment, because we think that the set of forecasts that we create should look like essentially the set of data points. Right? People see patterns where none exist. If you give people random walks, data that is generated from random walks, which is basically like stock market data, right? They will see patterns and illusionary trends all the time, even though none of those exist. It's just, the random walk took a couple of steps in the same direction that might look like a trend, right? And so people are very quick to spot illusionary trends where none exists, right? And people are over precise. If you ask them to attach any measure of confidence or uncertainty around their forecasts, the judgmental prediction intervals that people produce tend to be so much narrower than what they should be. So these are all very well documented, human individual decision biases, right? But there can be any additional political biases that affect the forecast, right? So I think we've fortunately moved away from making forecasting the obligation of sales departments, because if you ask salespeople to come up with a forecast, a whole lot of things happen, right? So the first thing that happens is salespeople usually realize that a forecast becomes their goal or their target, and so they like to lowball the forecast so that their targets are a little bit easier to accomplish. Or they realize that a forecast can influence the operations function, and they really want a lot of product that can be sold, right? And so they inflate the forecast that is communicated to operations so that more product is being made, right? So these are all classical sort of political ways of how a forecast becomes influenced in an organization. And something you need to be acutely aware about is, you need to shield the forecasting process as much as possible from these kind of biases, because they tend to just reduce accuracy, right? I'm not saying there's no role for human judgment in forecasting. Again, this is also something where we have quite a bit of research, on looking what role does human judgment still play. And the long and short of it is, in many organizations, the models are fundamentally incomplete, and human judgment serves as an important corrective action, right? So if you have a product that has a lot of promotions, and the promotions don't go into your forecasting models, that's a big omission, and you need somebody to basically say, we've scheduled a promotion, the forecast is off, right? Or if you have a commodity product which reacts hugely to prices, and the prices don't go into your forecasts, then again, you need a forecaster to be able to say, well, the statistical forecast might be off. So there is a role for human judgment still in forecasting, but it has to be a very deliberate and controlled role. Otherwise, forecasts can suffer from a lot of biases, and the accuracy can deteriorate as a result. And at the very least, you should always do what is called a forecast value added analysis, which kind of takes a look at, if people adjust the statistical forecast, which one was better, right? The original or the adjusted forecast. Ex post, you can always tell. And so you can see whether your accuracy improves through judgment. I think that concludes our presentation. So I just want to thank the audience for being, here with us and for listening to us. I want to thank my two co-presenters, Stephan and Bahman. It's always a pleasure to do this together with you. I want to thank our hosts for inviting us, and I want to invite everybody to read the book. We made it free because we do believe in the value of free educational content. We do believe that what we say in this book is important for so many different processes out there in the world, and we hope you will enjoy reading it. We hope you will learn a lot from it, and thank you so much for your patience and attention.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank the presenters as well. This was fascinating, and I'm sure if we listen to it one more time, we'll learn even more. There are many, many questions on the side, and we just have 14 minutes. So if you could go through it and see if there's one particular one that you feel needs to be addressed, I welcome you to jump in and answer quickly any of these questions that you see on the side.
Yeah, I'm already answering some of these in the chat. And in an organization, I'll just walk them down. There's one from Haruna Sabo. In an organization with over 100 SKUs, which forecasting method is best, and how frequent should the forecasting be, quarterly or annually? So yeah, I mentioned I'm in retail forecasting, so we typically have thousands of SKUs. I don't think there is one best method. Something that probably starts getting unwieldy with 100 SKUs is judgmental forecasting. So it's probably right at the boundary of where people can still write judgmental forecasts, or simply just write in numbers which they think is the best forecast. So at some point, other methods start to predominate. With just 100 SKUs, the more complex modern methods like boosting or neural networks will probably not work very well, simply because these use huge amounts of data. So I would, with 100 SKUs or over 100 SKUs, I would look for exponential smoothing, ARIMA, or simple multiple linear regression, depending on whether you have predictors. How frequently should the forecast be, quarterly or annually? There's two aspects here that I would like to keep apart. One is the time granularity. So do you forecast on an annual time bucket, or with quarterly time buckets, or with monthly, weekly, daily time buckets? And how often do you update your forecast? So they're two different things. So, and I would say in both cases, how you do that, should be driven by what you want to forecast for. If you're forecasting for an annual budget, then and you just need one number per year, then it probably is not very useful to forecast on monthly level. Then you just want to forecast on an annual level, but you may want to update the forecast, this annual forecast, every time you get new information. And that could be once a year, that could be every month, or that could be even in irregular intervals. Just if you get new information, you want to update your forecast. So as always, I don't think there is a single answer to be given here. It should very much depend on your again, domain knowledge on what you're forecasting for, but those are the things you want to keep in mind. Which of these methods can be applicable in humanitarian emergency situations? It's an interesting question. I think it's kind of orthogonal to what we're thinking about. Again, it depends very much on how much data you have and what you're forecasting for. If you just need to know how many ambulances you need for a mudslide, that is probably something that is just one number. And essentially the idea is probably just get in as many as you can, because there is never going to be enough. If it's more a question of what kind of foodstuffs you need to rush to an earthquake location, then it's probably something that can be done very quickly on the back of an envelope, understand how many people are affected, figure out the nutritional needs per person, and figure out how many sacks of rice, how many vegetables you need. That is a forecast, yes. And but there is no need to really run an exponential smoothing or an ARIMA model here. It's a simple case of algebra, understand how many people are affected. And of course, you should again update that as you learn that there are more or fewer people affected than you thought. If it's an ongoing emergency, like for instance, COVID-19, that is a humanitarian emergency that ran over months or over years, that's when you start thinking about forecasting methods. And that is, of course, an active area of research, what's happening here. And there you'd probably use ARIMA methods or similar methods, or more complicated panel data methods, because then you want to start modeling infections and reinfections and people being immune and vaccinations and stuff like that. So that's when you start thinking about causal methods and about actually really involving domain experts, because somebody who's doing retail forecasting won't be able to tell you anything about the kinetics, the population dynamics of infectious diseases. So again, it's really very much a question of having the data science people talk to the domain experts.
Stephan, that brings me to two other questions that I noticed. One of them on the retail side, since you're speaking, is how do you account for campaigns or for products that change through time? So this person was asking about treatment guidance that might change through time. I think it would be the same as fashion changing over time or iPhone updates. And then on the causal methods that you just finished speaking about, we commonly teach and do a forecasting method where we call demographics or morbidity, where we use and apply health statistics to the population data and then account for other factors such as, will doctors follow those treatments that they're supposed to give? Will that patient actually come to the system that you're providing the pharmaceuticals for? And we introduce a lot of assumptions into that. Is that what you call a causal method? And in the table that you had on complexity and accuracy in one of your slides, where would the causal method fall?
Yeah, so tons of questions that you just smuggled in. I'll start with the end and hope not to forget the beginning. Yeah, I would definitely say those are causal methods. And you start thinking about leading and lagging indicators. So you may be doing something today that only has an impact in a month, a year, in 2 years, in 5 years. For instance, education will often have an impact on an aggregate level, on a population level, only a few years down the road. And that is definitely a causal method. And we're talking about leading and lagging indicators in the book, in the chapter on causal methods. And that will be in the middle somewhere in that little graphic. That's also on the website and in the book, in the middle or on the bottom right. In terms of retail forecasting, and then I'll probably let somebody else do a little more talking too. I have entire presentations about retail forecasting on YouTube. So if you're really interested in that, just Google my name on YouTube and retail forecasting is hours on that. If you have a promotional campaign, for instance, the advantage of that is that you can forecast it very well because the retailer is setting it. The retailer can say, next month, we're running a campaign on this brand of shampoo. And if you've run a campaign before, then your causal method has learned the uplift for a campaign of this type. And there are typically many different campaigns that you can run. And then you can forecast that out. So we don't have that weather forecasting problem that I talked about. So that is pretty simple. On how people will react to the campaign, yeah. If you have had the campaign on this particular stock keeping unit, then you can learn from it and forecast that out. If you've seen the campaign on a different product, then you can use Bayesian methods, which we actually don't go into in the book, which is probably something we should put in somewhere, where you can say, okay, for similar methods, for similar SKUs, similar stock keeping units, this kind of campaign had a 10% uplift. So I'm going to say, if I don't know anything better, I'll assume that for this product that I'm forecasting for, this campaign again has a 10% uplift. This is a prior best guess, as long as I haven't seen anything particular about the product. So there's an idea of forecasting by analogy in here. So that makes sense in a situation like this here. When it comes to campaigns in the healthcare sector, which we're probably more interested in this audience than in the retail sector, these are typically longer running campaigns. It's not just a 2-week marketing campaign for a bottle of shampoo. It's more something along the lines of education and educating people, or running out a vaccination campaign that typically runs longer. What may be useful here is scenario analysis. So run a forecast with a high uptake of the vaccination, a medium uptake, and a low uptake of the vaccination. Then you have 3 scenarios. And that is useful to start the conversation and say, okay, what do we want to prepare for? How much vaccines do we want to stockpile? If the high uptake vaccination scenario says we need so and so many, we can prepare for that. Does that mean that some of the vaccines need to be thrown away because they have a limited shelf life? If so, perhaps you want to stockpile for the medium scenario. Then we watch the initial uptake and say, okay, is the initial uptake more consistent with a high uptake scenario, a medium or low uptake scenario? So now we're talking about this updating of forecasts. And so it all ties together, and forecasting is not a field where you can just say, here's a solution for forecasting. Forecasting is so much dependent on what you're forecasting for, that the most we can say here is really give some general guidance, and you really need to do a lot of tailoring to your specific situation. And sorry for talking so much.
Enno and Bahman, I wonder if you've noticed any questions that you wanted to jump in and address?
Not really. So there was a question about humanitarian emergency, or I think Stephan discussed that, but I have actually worked with some data from ICRC. So this data has some characteristics, so that it has intermittent nature. So that's probably one thing that it is common across, like humanitarian crisis. So you may deal with intermittent time series data. So this kind of data require a specific methods to deal with. I have also observed obsolescence with actually those time series data. So again, this is something that you need to maybe be aware of. Another thing that we came across was with ICRC, they had different medical teams operating from different countries. And because of that, they also changed the type of medical items they were using. And again, that introduces new items with short time series, and another one, like maybe a stop in a warehouse, and then a new product again goes in because of the team. So maybe these are also the sort of like information that you need to include if you build a model when it comes to conflict or humanitarian zones.
I just want to briefly comment on, there were some questions about like, how do you best predict sort of in changing markets? And maybe one thing I want to say about that. So forecasting methods are specifically, designed to deal with change in a sense, right? In the sense that they pick up changes very quickly. So if you talk about exponential smoothing, that's what the parameterization of exponential smoothing is explicitly about, is like, how much do you believe there are fundamental changes in the market? But that being said, those methods are always reactive, like they're supposed to detect changes in the data. But if for example, next month something is going to happen that influences demand, the model itself doesn't know that, unless you model it explicitly and basically tell the model that this is what's going to happen, and you have an estimate on what the impact is. The model itself doesn't know that, right? So this is sort of the point where judgment can still be important, because models are always ultimately incomplete. And you might know, for example, that the HIV medication is going to fundamentally change 6 months from now, right? That's all kind of pre-announced, and it's going to happen. No forecasting model knows it, and that's why that might be very important information that just requires your judgment.
I have one last question, perhaps, is a little bit more on the weighted versus unweighted forecasting, and why, again, was the unweighted better?
So this is sort of, Stephan alluded to this, right? So if you have, for example, multiple forecasts, either whether they're statistical forecasts or whether they are judgmental forecasts that people have produced, the question is always like, how do you reconcile this? How do you recombine this, right? And the simple rule in forecasting is just average. And there is actually quite a bit of research that has gone into it. You can think about designing, like, just average means equal weights, right? Each of these forecasts has the same weight. You could go fancy and try to find different weights of how, like, oh, we give more weight to this forecaster or more weight to this method. And that usually doesn't work. You could also, instead of weighing, you can think about weighing as being something like a group decision process, where you bring different forecasters or people together and say which forecast works better. And then the long and short of it is, group decision processes can be so biased that usually doesn't create a better outcome either. So it's a very almost radical recommendation to just average, and it just seems to work.
And I know we're over time, but you said group decision making sometimes doesn't, makes it worse. But is there a limit to that group? So if you have 5 people versus 20 people, and those 5 people bring in the expertise on what the next campaign will look like, or how much money the budget is likely to have because they know something political, that might help improve you. But if you have too many, you go over too many, then you have too much noise in what the future may be.
Actually, the key is, if you have 5 or 20,
It doesn't
if you want to have my advice, I would say, have them make independent judgments. Right? Have them just sit down and make their judgments. It's great that you have 5 or 20 people. If you have 20, that's even better than 5, although it might be more costly because it's the time of 20 people, right? So there's sort of seeing decreasing returns. But the key is, make them have independent judgments and then just average them. That tends to work better than putting them in a room and having them come up with a reconciled
Right.
forecast.
Thank you for that. That's interesting. That's behavioral science
Yes.
that is and coming into play. Thank you again. This is invaluable. Barry had to drop off, but this kind of information I will iterate is amazing. Your book is amazing. I think you in some way have improved pharmaceutical forecasting around the world. I can say that for sure. And we appreciate your time for giving to the IAPHL community. Thank you again. We will continue this conversation online in the listserv. And Nadia, is there anything you want to close out with?
Just a big thank you again. I think for all of us, our goal is really to push this information out as much as possible, right? So if you like our book, please send it to others. Leave us nice reviews, nice comments, put it on social media. That all helps. We really don't do this because we earn money with it. We do this because we believe in the value of it. So thank you for spreading the word.
Pleasure.
Same for me. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful being here. I hope this was helpful to any of you. If anybody has any remaining questions, we're on the mailing list. So perhaps you can just ask anything on the mailing list and other people will see the same question, because it's likely if you have a question, other people have the same questions. So just ask on the list and we'll answer. We'll try to answer for everybody. Bahman, any last words?
Oh, yes, no, same here. Thanks so much for the invitation. I think, Laila, there is someone created a forecasting community or forum or something on the discussion, if I'm not wrong, in the community.
I did post some questions earlier. I think it might have gotten lost because I didn't see any responses back, but the IAPHL list, yes.
Yeah, but there is a community like dedicated to forecasting. I think
there was at one time. It's become somewhat inactivated, but we can try to bring it back up.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, if there is any more question, maybe I go if it comes through the mailing list. Yeah, we're happy to answer, I think. And yeah, thanks Laila and Nettie and Tim for the brilliant job.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I will not add much, just to thank you again and ask for people that is in the room if they are part of IAPHL or not. If you are not, you will find a link in the chat box to be able to register and join the community. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take
care, everyone. Have
Thanks.
a wonderful weekend.
Take care.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.